in our knowledge. We have an expert's knowledge if we're a chemist about chemistry, but we're fairly unknowledgeable about other areas. Now, if you think that's true in the sciences, then you can triple it, quadruple it, if you try to think of a scientist of any type who knows anything about the history of his discipline or the philosophy that's evolved with it. And so this is part of our problem when we try to present our creation ideas today. It's not just a science subject, it's related to history, philosophy, theology as well. But many of these people in their expert training, they have only gotten the narrow science training, and even then that training is limited pretty much to their own discipline. So at this lecture at Auburn, as I was giving the material, it occurred to me a few days later as I was thinking about my experience that day, well, this is very much like Swiss cheese. Has all the holes if you were to have an aerial view and look at the whole thing. And each one sees the holes in his area. Like the geologist knew the problems in geology, the chemist knew the problems in chemistry, the physicist knew the problems in physics. So what we began to do is to say, let's put together a book that deals with the legitimate, valid criticisms from all these different disciplines and see what happens. So that's part of what this book deals with. The end result of it was, though, we needed to have a positive thing to say. I could not stand just being a critic. What are we going to say that's legitimate and positive? And it was at this point that I went back to the article that I mentioned at the outset about DNA, about life transcending physics and chemistry by Michael Polanyi in 1967. Because as I read that article again and again, I could not help but think that there's something more involved. As I analyzed the experiments, I realized that the investigator was doing something to make the experiment successful, but was attributing the success to the processes of nature, whereas in fact the investigator had done something to make the experiment work. And as I read and widened my reading, I began to think of in terms of a whole new discipline that had emerged called information theory. And information theory is the communications theory that's burgeoned in the computer industry, and we all know about that, cyberspace and internet and all the other things that have come from all of this technology. But the idea of it was very simple. If we can determine the measure of information in any structure, whether it's a pile of leaves or whether it's a living organism, a rock or a rocket ship, then we will be tremendously down the road in terms of understanding these issues about complex objects like living beings. So I began to study these things. The end result of all that was that we found that there is a legitimate way to distinguish things that are highly complex, like living things, and things that are like a crystal and ordered. And this was basically what Polanyi was trying to get at in his article, but he didn't quite spell it out. And so as we studied and we finally put all this together, it was late one evening in my office in Dallas as I was thinking through all these issues. And I can remember the night, the overwhelming impact that this had on me. I said, good grief, DNA is not just like a code, it is a code. It's not just like a message in a book, it is a message. Except it's not in a book, it's in the cell, and it's in every cell of every living thing. Now, what does that get me? Because I know that by experience, intelligence is required to put the letters together in a proper way to convey a message. Whew, boy, but I never heard of anybody suggest that intelligence produced living things, except religious people. What do I do? Because I'm a chemist. I can't go around and be talking about that. And so it took me several years of talking and corresponding, and everybody that I knew was being worried to death by me because I was pestering them with questions. I wanted to know whether it was possible and legitimate to bring intelligent cause into the area of science. Every scientist I knew, whether he was a Christian or whether he was not a Christian, said, no, absolutely not. You cannot do that. Well, I wanted to know why not. Who said we cannot? And this is part of what I was saying earlier. Most scientists are really not that knowledgeable about the history and philosophy of science. So I began to read and study the history of philosophy of science. When I was at Harvard, my study was in the history of science. And I had a lot of the questions back then that I could use, and things I discovered that I could apply later. In fact, the second book, The Soul of Science, that I mentioned a few minutes ago, that Nancy Piercy and I wrote, that is published just last year, this tells the story about the Christian influence on the rise and development of modern science. And I would really encourage you to look at it. It's not just a plug for my own book, but it's a fascinating story. At the same time, it's information we all need, and please pass it on to the professors in science because they need to know this too. I think many of them are unaware. It's not that they are stubbornly resistant. Like me, they went through the educational program in their science discipline, and they never really knew the history of it, what's behind it. And so once I discovered this, I began to question and ask more and more questions about the possibility of bringing an intelligent cause into science. Now, my views over the years began to change and about how to do this. The end result of it was that now I've put the argument in several books and essays that I've written. As Tom mentioned earlier, I gave the lecture. It was really a very scary thing for me to do when I went to Princeton and give that lecture, because I knew I was going to be fried and boiled and stripped and everything else right there in that classroom, in that lecture hall. And afterwards, here was the response that really intrigued me most. One of the graduate students of a famous physicist said, "You tricked us." "I tricked you?" I said. He said, "Yes, you tricked us." I said, "Well, how did I trick you? What was the trick? What happened? Tell me what you mean." He said, "Well, we followed your argument right down the line, and we agreed with you. Good science, good methodology, right down to the end, until you got right to the end, and then you had us all believing that God made things, and we know there's no God there." So I thought to myself, well, I never mentioned God in my argument. And you see, I think this is part of what's going on here. The Romans 1, for example, tells us that nature has a structure to it, that people will draw the conclusion and they know that somebody made it. And the problem is that we have been denied. It's sort of like living in Los Angeles and you're trying to understand what Psalm 19 means when it says the heavens declare the glory of God. You can't even see the heavens if you live in LA. And so the problem we've got then is we are trying to understand about these things when, because of arguments that have been thrown up against any belief or knowledge in God, we can't see it. And this, I think, is the great significance and power of Darwin's argument. It's been described as one long argument, not one long proof. And the reason it's one long argument is that there is no proof in the normal sense. And so it's a persuasive technique, a rhetorical device, if you will, that was very effective in the 19th century. But what's happening in this century is a whole host of things we don't have time for this morning. I've only focused on this one element of the origin of living things, and particularly the DNA question, to show you that there are huge developments within the sciences that are putting stress and pressure upon these different origin theories that are challenging the various materialistic hypotheses. And so as I travel in different places, I stand confidently before my audience and I say, yes, there is empirical evidence to show that intelligence did this. Why not? And you know what the response usually is? It cannot be. We cannot bring intelligence in. Why not? It would kill science. Why would it kill science? We can't do anything. We can't put God in a test tube or a flask. Can't do any experiments on that. So wait a minute. Let's think about this once again. Are you telling me that the concept of intelligence in the science we cannot entertain? Yes, it's not possible. Wait a minute, let's go back. We are spending a lot of money through NASA and other agencies to search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And what are we looking for that would tell us that there is an extraterrestrial out there? We don't have any empirical evidence such beings are there. So what are we looking for in the search? We are looking for signals that have the characteristic structure that it would fit the pattern experience shows is the result of intelligence. I say, hey, that's right. What do you do if you look at the structure of these sentences in this book? Even if you don't know English, what do you conclude from this? It takes intelligence to put that together. Is not the DNA structured exactly the same way? Why do we call DNA and protein informational molecules? It's because they convey information inside the cell. We know from experience the clams crawling up on the beach don't scratch out John loves Mary there. We know that wind and erosion don't put the faces of presidents on rock cliffs in South Dakota, Mount Rushmore. We know from experience that it takes intelligence to do those things. If we can discern that by experience, why not focus the same thing through the microscope, look at DNA, and see it has exactly the same structure? Why not? It's a philosophic problem. Why not? And our philosophy today is dominated by materialistic thought rather than theistic thought. I'm of the opinion that had this knowledge about DNA been available a century and a quarter ago, Darwin would never have written his book. In fact, he might have been one of the leaders in the intelligent design argument. Who knows? Because he said at one point he almost had Paley's design argument memorized by heart and thought it was a very persuasive argument. He didn't like it. He was turning toward materialistic ideas. I'm not saying that everybody would be a theist or a Christian if this had been known back then, because certainly they were not before. But my point is that naturalism has substituted for theism in our whole culture. And we are seeing things within science itself that is putting the squeeze on the naturalistic theories. And I believe it is time for theists of all types, whether Christians or Jews or Muslims, who really have an understanding that in their basic philosophy, that there is a basis for an intelligent beginning of life, to stand up and rethink and be counted. Now, as we conclude this, I would like to encourage you that the fact is, over the years, we have seen many people begin to change their thought and perspective on this. As I travel in Eastern Europe and Russia and to universities, I have seen many wonderful things happen. I would just like to close with one experience that happened on my very first trip as I went into Romania. This book was translated into Romanian not long after it was printed. We had a Romanian graduate student call our office and say, would you mind if we translated this into Romanian? Well, I must admit, the only one I knew from Romania was Nadia Comaneci, the gymnast. I didn't really know where Romania was. Not much of a geography student in those days. And so we were fascinated, and the process was begun to translate the book. The book was translated. The book was printed. We had 3,000 copies sitting in a warehouse in Vienna. Christmas Day, 1989, Ceausescu was executed, the wicked dictator of Romania. I had a student at the time at the Julian Center who had taken people into Eastern Europe. He saw the translated copy of Mystery on my desk, and we started talking. 3 months later, I was flying in a plane into Romania, and I had given lectures at some of the leading universities in that country, and during that time, I gave arguments that's in the book also, history and philosophy of science issues, but the thing that struck me more than anything else was the vacuum that was there. They had never heard things that I mentioned in my lectures. In fact, after the lecture, there was one man who ran down the street toward me, and he says, Professor Dr. Thaxton. Tears in his eyes, I turned to see this man, and I said, what is it? He stuck his hand out to touch me, both of them on my shoulders. He says, you are a real miracle, a miracle. He just said a miracle again and again. Not usually a miracle for people. So I asked him, what he meant. And he said, a Christian and a scientist in one body. That is a miracle. In Eastern Europe and Russia, by definition, a scientist is an atheist. Now, the people ask me on time to time as I come back to the States, why do they have so much science over there? If we have any science students here, math students here, let me encourage you that whenever you think about all the horrible study you have to do in your science and math, if you were an Romanian student in chemistry in high school on your way to college, by the time you got to college, you'd have 8 years of physics, 7 years of chemistry, 8 years of biology, and mathematics through differential equations and calculus before you got to college. Now the question is, why do they have so much emphasis on science? Very simple logic. Because they can't monitor everybody to inoculate them against belief in God, so what do? Teach them science. Their thought is, if you teach them enough science, they won't think about God. Because they have a logic that goes like this. Science gives you truth, and the truth is there is no God. So when I come in, and as a scientist, I stand before them and I speak these things and I raise these questions, not from outside science, throwing stones at it. You see, that's what the difference is. But from within these disciplines of science, raising legitimate questions, not outrageous things, but questions that come up from within science. I had some experiences at Harvard when I was there. I would go into the history of science office and I would ask questions and they would say, where in the world did you get that question? That's right. And I say, well, I just asked the question. I read the study. It seems right to me to ask the question. People, we can have questions come from our theistic background, our theistic mindset, within the context of these various academic disciplines. There is a blind spot that's created by people who are thinking materialistically all their life. And we can think of things that will give them new thoughts for the first time, legitimate thoughts, start trains of thought. Somebody asked me earlier about being in Romania. I'm a missionary or evangelist or something. Well, really, I don't consider myself that, but maybe I am. I don't know. I feel like I'm just a chemist who struggled and stumbled onto some things in these areas, and I guess I was taught the empirical methods and the methods of science, and I just want to make sure we're consistent with them in this area as well as some of the other areas. And I believe with all my heart that we see within every living thing and every cell the evidence that shows and speaks that it was created. It's not just the result of these natural processes. Now, of course, if you're a materialist, you don't want to hear that message. So you don't want to hear it. And so if you have to change the methodology of science to make sure that message is not heard, well, then it must be done. But I really do believe that there are many people who are theists or even who are not theists, who they just need to think about this issue a bit, and then they can see and realize that I'm not forcing things. It's not a trick like the professor said, like the student said at Princeton. It's just applying the methods to science in a consistent way across the board. Well, you've been a very gracious and kind and thoughtful audience this morning, and I love your attention. And I thank you very much, Tom, for inviting me here.
Well, that was Dr. Charles Thaxton, a powerful address to this kind of a mixed audience, actually. And what I've noticed, Tom, was something I never thought of, that we just accept almost anything and everything. And he said it's so important to see how that research was done.
Yes.
And that's where he found a real breakdown.
Yeah, well, in the book that he was talking about, he lifted it up several times. The Mystery of Life's Origin has a whole chapter, and it has an interesting name. It's called Illegitimate Investigator Interference. And what he's pointing out is that these investigators, that's another word for a scientist, illegitimately sort of steer these reactions down certain pathways. And he points out that if you just left a soup of chemicals sit there and waited 5 billion years, you come back 5 billion years later, you'd still have a soup of chemicals, or it might be fermented or whatever. Of course, that wouldn't happen if you didn't have bacteria. But what he's pointing out in his book is that there is a lot of intelligence that's being put into these experiments. And what really kills me, what really bothers me, no end, is that the public high school textbooks never tell you that. There is no fine print in the public high school textbooks. The problems with these theories, the problem with experiments that are just so numerous, it takes a whole book to begin to really just trot them out and put them out in front of you. Those problems are never presented. There's not even a hint that there is a problem.
This brings up a conversation I had with you on the phone a few days ago, and it was a big thing in the newspaper, that a scientist found a dinosaur,
Okay.
dead obviously,
Yes.
sitting on some eggs,
All right.
and said he or she or whatever it was had been there 80 million years. Well, maybe most people reading the Times said, wow. Well, I thought maybe it was 79 million, or was it 81 million?
I remember your question.
But people take that
Yes.
face value.
Yeah, and we just swallow. I mean, it's like, there is such a deferring to the authority of science. If science says it, then it must be true. And I would say if science says it, we should stick our little, questioning ears
like a politician.
Out. Yes, there you go. We need to bring science and
Yes.
put them side by side with politicians. Anyway.
You know what he's really doing is proving there is a God without mentioning his name.
Well, he's using the word
Intelligence.
intelligent cause, and what he's explaining is that there is inescapable evidence that there is an intelligence. And I like what he says, that science really can't directly lead you to God. You need the Scriptures. The Scriptures are the ones, the Scriptures are the source that identify who this intelligence is. Science can only take you so far, but the good news is that that intelligence, that God that we know personally, has made himself known personally through his Son. And I was going to say that the interesting thing that I had him add at the end of his talk was that Dr. Thaxton has really personally touched some key scientists, including the one that we mentioned and that I asked him to
well, when you get an endorsement from atheists on your book,
right.
It's a pretty powerful book. So we're going to show them the video,
right,
where you ask him to add something to what he'd already
basically,
said.
And I think that speaks for itself.
Okay, yes, you can take a look at this and see where Tom wanted him to come back for.
This is the
second time.
PS.
The PS. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, Charles, could you share what happened with a certain, and we cannot identify, it's a little bit confidential, but one of the leading scientists in the world, certainly one of the leading scientists in the United States, a name that would be instantly recognized in any scientific circle. Could you share, when you sent a copy of Mystery of Life's Origin, what he said, the impact? I think you know the gentleman I'm talking about.
Yeah, right. Well, I've had a number of experiences very similar to the one I'm going to tell you. First of all, can I just add one thing more, because I was going to mention it earlier and I forgot. One of the things we wanted to do with this book was not to set up a straw man and then kind of knock it over. We didn't feel like that was legitimate criticism. So once we finished the manuscript, we sent it to Dean Kenyon, who was an expert. I mentioned he wrote the book Biochemical Predestination. And we sent him the manuscript, and he read it and gave a very positive response. And so we asked him, would you write the foreword to the book? He said, I'd be glad to. And so that's why his foreword is in this book, even though he wrote the Bible on this subject of chemical evolution some years before. He had changed his own mind over the years, and many of the criticisms that we had in this book were the same ones he had, but he says, I haven't got time to write that book. I'll just give all my friends your book. And so that was very positive. But what Tom was talking about was another professor. We had given this manuscript to many different people who were knowledgeable, and we knew that before we went to press, we wanted to get their criticism. So it wasn't the book, it was a manuscript pre-publication that we sent this professor. And so I talked with him later about the manuscript. In fact, all 12 of the people we sent the book to, every single one of the 12 had a positive response to the manuscript. So we thought, wow, these are all experts right in the field, and this is amazing that they all thought the thing was worthwhile. Usually there got to be some critics somewhere, and there are critics, but what I'm saying is that they overall thought the book was positive. But this one professor I talked to, he's an atheist, and he's well known, and he said, your manuscript gave me more positive thoughts about God than any book I've read in 30 years. And I said, really? I said, that's really interesting. We never talked about God. He said, I know, but it's just there. And I knew when I heard that, I was so thrilled, because that was our purpose when we wrote the book. We didn't want to preach. We wanted to say something that was legitimate, believing, I was believing anyway, that Romans 1 is right. That if you can see nature and you can see it there, people will think and they will be pointed toward the Creator. So if in fact it says, Tom has said, an impactful book for all these people, I think that it is a combination of a lot of factors that makes that possible, makes that true. And I'm very thankful, and I thank God for the ability and the friends that helped me put it together. Thanks, Tom.
I'm thankful that Professor Woodward brought this gentleman to our area, and it was a very, very powerful statement to say this book made me start thinking about God when God was never ever mentioned in the book.
Actually, the epilogue, the chapter at the end of the book that talks about alternatives to chemical evolution, says Creator beyond the cosmos. That's the only reference. It never actually uses the word God, but the conclusion was inescapable.
Guy